Good evening. Last fall, the House of Representatives decided to try to answer once and for all the persistent doubts about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The House set up a special or select committee to investigate once again what actually happened in Dallas, to ask again the nagging questions about how many shots were fired, by whom, and from where, questions about foreign involvement, domestic cover-up, motives, and connections. Black congressmen insisted that the committee also investigate similar questions about the killing of Martin Luther King. Tonight, that committee's work is at a virtual standstill, embroiled in a tangled drama not involving the assassinations, but those appointed to investigate. Tonight, we look at that drama and what's behind it. Jim?
And it's drama, Robin, with all of the characteristics of satirical comedy, something Art Buchwald might write to make Congress look foolish. Here's what happened. When the new Congress convened in January, Congressman Henry Gonzalez of Texas took over chairmanship of that House Assassinations Committee. It wasn't long before he was tangled with the committee's chief counsel, Richard Sprague, over Sprague's request for a $6.5 million annual budget and his administrative and investigative techniques, among other things. So last week, Gonzalez fired Sprague, giving him until 5 o'clock one afternoon to clear out of his office. But Sprague refused to vacate. Then the 11 other members of the committee rescinded the firing and asked him to stay on. Sprague, of course, agreed. Then Gonzalez got the Attorney General's office to refuse further FBI files and documents to Sprague and his staff. A few days later, there was a committee meeting. All of the players were present. The final fight was to be fought, the matter resolved. But before Gonzalez could bring up the Sprague matter, the other members adjourned the meeting. Then another meeting was set for Monday. But Gonzalez, now sick in bed back home in Texas, couldn't make it. Tonight, he's still in Texas, and Sprague is still in his office, and the matter is still very much unresolved. Now, those are just the high points of the total story. One man who's been following the roles and pitches of this committee from the very beginning is George Lardner, Jr. of the Washington Post. Mr. Lardner, what is your reading on why Gonzalez is so determined to get rid of Sprague?
I think he just feels that he's got to be the boss, and Sprague was promised that he would be the boss, and there's just this irreconcilable difference between them. When Sprague was hired last fall, he was promised he would have complete authority in hiring and firing by Congressman Downing, which was probably an easy promise for Downing to make because he was leaving.
He retired, didn't run for re-election.
No, he was just gone. And Gonzalez came aboard, and he was already a little nettled, I think it's fair to say, about having been passed over for the chairmanship the first time around, because he was the first one to introduce a resolution calling for an investigation like this. So when he finally got to be chairman, he told Sprague he had to fire some people. He had hired too many. He was spending too much. And Sprague, probably relying on what Downing had promised him, said no. And Gonzalez couldn't sit still for that. He told the House Rules Committee a couple of weeks ago that he comes from bronco-busting country. And
South Texas.
Yeah. Right.
Well, what about Sprague now? Sprague seems equally determined to stay as Gonzalez is to get rid of him. What's Sprague's motivation to stay, to hang in there so tough?
Well, part of it, I suppose, although he isn't talking much for publication these days, but part of it, I suppose, is that he has all 11 other members of the committee apparently on his side, at least in the initial showdown. Some of them are saying, well, they told Sprague to stay on the job because Henry didn't follow the right procedure, and that their action shouldn't be taken as any final indication of what they're going to do. But I know you just have to wait for the next.
Yeah, right. I know this is a tricky question, but do you think Sprague knew he was on this firm ground, that he had the support of those 11 other members when he refused to vacate that, in that first confrontation when Gonzalez first fired him?
Yes, I do, because there had been a couple of what they like to call informal secret meetings of committee members the previous Monday and Tuesday. The first Monday meeting, Sprague wasn't there, but Gonzalez broached the idea of getting rid of some committee staffers. And the upshot, as I gather, of that meeting was for Sprague to be brought in. Let's see how he feels. And then the next morning, Gonzalez and Sprague had a disagreement in Gonzalez's office. And there was another meeting, informal meeting later that day, and there was no vote, but it was plain that Gonzalez was all alone in insisting that there be some firings.
All right, now this is a very unusual matter, George, where members of Congress would side with a staff member over their own, one of their own, and chairman of a committee.
Yes.
Why are they doing this?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. If you talk to Gonzalez and his people, they say the other members just don't realize how insulting, in effect, and insubordinate Sprague has been. If you talk to the other members, you get the impression that, well, they're upset because Henry just upped and fired him without even calling them, which he did. And so they initially told Sprague, stay put until we have a meeting. And then last week, as Henry was about to launch his attack, calling Sprague rattlesnake several times.
Rattlesnake that needs to be stomped on.
That's right.
Is the
That's
direct
right.
Quote.
But
Yeah.
he did it only for us. The rest of the committee had moved out, adjourned over his protest.
Yeah, and then he was just left to have a press conference, right?
That's right. We took the committee members' chairs.
I see. I see. Okay, thank you. Another reporter who's been on this story from the beginning is Nicholas Horrock, first for the New York Times and now with Newsweek magazine, where he heads its Special Projects Unit. Is it a personality problem, or do you think there's something more substantial involved in this Sprague-Gonzalez thing?
The actual confrontation apparently is some personality, mainly personality, but I think there's a problem with the investigation and a problem with how Mr. Sprague came down to Washington. When I first met him, and when other reporters talked to him last fall, he seemed totally unwilling to play the congressional game, and there is some of it has to be done. It's done by committee councils routinely. That is, understanding the leadership, trying to find out where your power lies. Instead, he constantly said, I'm going to set up this budget, I'm going straight full steam ahead, and if I don't get it, I'm going to quit. And I think last year he was probably deluded a little because not only Mr. Downing, but other people weren't focusing on the problem. They were running for re-election. Carl Albert was leaving the Congress. So Mr. Sprague may have felt that he had support where it didn't exist, and the real test came after January 20th with a new Congress.
Well, you know, Nick, some people have suggested that the committee has been shot down through a conspiracy of unnamed people, but most of the conspirators are usually considered to be members of the intelligence community. Do you think there's anything to that?
No, I think that one lacks any kind of base. I think that the intelligence agencies, that is the FBI and the CIA, clearly were embarrassed about what they did at that time, and there's a lot
You mean
of
at the time of the
various
various
assassination,
investigations?
withholding information and bureaucratic problem. But I think that we have new managements in those long since, and I think that they were willing to turn over information on substantial information on any of the details. And furthermore, I don't believe that that kind of a conspiracy of ex-agents works very effectively. We heard the same thing a few weeks ago when Ted Sorensen didn't get a nomination. That's a popular view, but there's very little evidence of it.
You'll have to admit, though, Nick, it is right out of the COINTELPRO guidebook for destroying, you know, for destroying some, because the fact is the committee is in really bad shape now, and all of these factors seem to have all come together at one time. I mean, I'm not pushing the theory.
Yeah.
I'm just
I can understand where you could see that, but again, who are the people doing it? In fact, they're congressmen themselves. They're people within the framework of the Congress. We don't have any. I think the former agents clubs and so forth have been rather silent on the whole matter.
What about those who say that, of course, the Kennedy family did not want this investigation from the first place, and that has been a problem and has caused eventually caused the problems that we have right now because of that?
The Kennedys don't want the investigation. Several times that I've had to work on investigation stories where I've had to call them about it, their press representatives and others really tell you that reopens for them a terrible tragedy. But that's quite a different matter than using their political influence, particularly with Tip O'Neill, the majority leader, who is from their state and a personal friend, of course. That's quite a different matter. I cannot see the Kennedys picking up a telephone, Senator Kennedy or anyone else, and saying, put a stop to this investigation. They understand politics. They don't want to be in that role. And so I think that's highly unlikely. I read some of the things that suggested that.
Do you think, though, that in the final analysis that the investigation would have even gotten this far had the King assassination investigation not been appended to it?
No, I think it needed the King assassination. I think that is the one. Put aside all of our national emotion. Serious investigators found more question about how that was handled. It had been reinvestigated far less. There are some serious questions, but more important, it has behind it. To me, that's the main purpose that you get your Black Caucus pressure. Black members of Congress are going along and using their influence to support this committee because they want a reopening of the King investigation and are not against the reopening of the Kennedy one, but that's a parallel subject to them. So I think the King thing had a lot to do with the real gut support for it in the beginning.
All right, thank you. Robin?
Well, as you see, there are different ways of looking at this mess in Washington, and as Jim says, one angle suggests a conspiracy of some sort to sabotage the committee's work. One reporter who has referred to that possibility is Jerry Polikoff, a freelance journalist. Polikoff has been researching the Kennedy assassination for 11 years and has been covering the Gonzales Committee story for New Times magazine. Jerry, do you believe there is a conspiracy to sabotage the committee?
Well, I don't think it boils down to a conspiracy, a concerted conspiracy on the part of the press, but I do believe that there's an attitude inherent in the press that's existed going back to 1964 during the life of the Warren Commission and following the report of the Warren Commission. The press, I think, was a little bit too quick to endorse the findings of the Warren Commission, to accept leaks of the Warren Commission, and to endorse the feeling that we had to put rumors of conspiracy behind us and go on to other things.
So just, can I interrupt a moment? Any conspiracy you might be thinking about is not the sort of ex-agents club that Nick Horrock was talking about or anything like that. You're talking about the behavior of the press.
Well, I think you really can't take it out of context like that. I think one of the unfortunate things is that Nick Horrock has been the recipient of some of the leaks from the intelligence agencies that I think are designed to push any further investigation of the Kennedy assassination in a particular direction, and a direction that leads away from any involvement either in the assassination or in any cover-up from the intelligence agencies. And I think it's understandable, because Nick Horrock has printed some of those stories, that he would be anxious to discount the possibility.
Well, we'll ask him about that in a minute. But first of all, what would be the motive of organs of the press, like Newsweek or Washington Post or the New York Times, in undoing the committee?
Well, I don't think it's a conscious effort to undo the committee. I think it goes back to an attitude. The press as a whole, as an institution, overwhelmingly endorsed the lone assassin findings of the Warren Commission. The Warren Report was published by the New York Times in association with Bantam, in association with the Book of the Month Club. The entire findings were published as a supplement by the New York Times. The same attitude prevailed with the Washington Post, with the Washington Star, with Newsweek, with the Washington Press Corps in general. And it's basically it wasn't very... It wasn't very good reporting. It wasn't very factual reporting. It was pretty much based on faith. Now, times have changed. Watergate has changed a lot of things. But
mind you, immediately after the assassination report came out of the Warren Commission, there weren't very many other people questioning it right away either, were there? It took a while for that.
No, but if you want to look at it, really almost immediately after the assassination, before there was any chance to investigate the assassination thoroughly, discounting whether there was a conspiracy or not, the story being touted around by the FBI was that there was no conspiracy. And the initial findings of the FBI, which were completed very shortly after the assassination, were leaked by Mr. Hoover directly to the press. The Warren Commission, within 12 days after it had begun its field report of the assassination, begun investigating what had happened, was leaking findings to the press that there was no conspiracy, and that's what the report would show. Now, I don't think this was responsible reporting, and I think really, when we come down to it now, the press has not acted very responsibly in this matter, and I think...
Well, let's come back to the committee for a moment, and back to the Sprague-Gonzales fracas that's going on at the moment. What is your opinion of that yourself and the way the press has been covering that?
Okay, well, I don't want to be in the position of endorsing everything that's happened with the Gonzales Committee and with Mr. Sprague. I think there have been some serious mistakes down there. I think Mr. Sprague has shown some poor judgment on several occasions. I think Mr. Gonzalez has shown worse judgment on several occasions with his dealings with the rest of the committee. I do think that some of the reporting, particularly the reporting of the New York Times, has been very unfactual in terms of what's going on in the committee. I think a lot of the reporting has been slanted towards really highlighting the personality disputes between Mr. Gonzalez and Mr. Sprague, where the real issue is whether the investigation should be conducted. I think something that's been ignored completely is the staff that's been assembled, the attitudes of the other 11 committee members. It's really become, in the press, a reporting of all the circus characteristics of this thing.
Okay, well, let's come on in a few minutes to whether there should be an investigation and
Okay.
questions like that. For the minute, let's go back to, first of all, to George Lardner. What do you feel about Jerry Polikoff's observations?
Well, I think he's going back a little too far into history. The Warren Commission report was full of inadequacies, I think, and it was not recognized properly at the time. But then to jump from there to the coverage of the House Assassinations Committee and to somehow connect the two up, it seems to me to not be valid. The circus atmosphere that Mr. Polikoff speaks of is there. In fact, there's very little else under the tent that is to be seen. The press would probably be happy to report what the investigators are doing, what they're finding, but they're not telling anybody, nor I suppose should they. But beyond that, I don't think they're finding or doing very much at this point in time. I checked over at the committee today. They can't even make long-distance phone calls, not even collect long-distance phone calls. The Capitol Hill operator won't put them through. This is at orders of Chairman Gonzalez. So when you have developments like that popping you in the face, I don't think it's unfair to go ahead and report them.
Mr. Horrock?
The main reason, or the best basis for this investigation was to lay the minds of the American people at rest that the Warren Commission had been right or wrong and to clear up contradictions and innuendo. In fact, can a committee who has become a circus, whether the press covers it or not, has done it on its own, now give us a valid report that's going to be a stamp of this kind of credibility? I think Sprague came down with some awfully good ideas. The idea of using police officers instead of somebody in a federal law enforcement complex, these were good. But instead of that, we don't have that. We find him, I think, in taking on a battle role. We have Gonzalez in a battle with him. And I can't see, even if they can figure out how to get a budget, survive March, why should we give any more credence to their investigation after this kind of a start than we are going to the Warren Commission? We had the same problem with the Pike Committee. The Pike Committee started out to do a good investigation. Central Intelligence Agency was the most aggressive of the two committees investigating that. But again, by injudicious activity and arguing and bantering in the South, they lost all their credence. And by the end of it, the Senate report is the one we now all talk of. The House committee had gotten started on good things, but it lost a lot of the credibility.
So is your point that the committee is demolishing itself, and it's not the press that's, by witnessing that's demolishing it?
Absolutely. And the other thing is, and to underscore what George said, I would venture to say any active reporter now covering that committee was not covering the Warren Commission. The editors, by and large, have changed. And this idea that there's some kind of a continuing cover-up or a continuing interest in avoiding, most of the people covering this present committee have made their reputations on covering conspiracy, have made the money that they've earned for the past 5 or 6 years on nothing but government conspiracy. So if they were going to conspire, I would think it would be to perpetuate. We all need a good Hill investigation. That makes heroes of us all. So, no, I think it would cut the other way.
Want to reply to that?
Yeah, if we really look at this from the beginning, one of the first things that got the committee into trouble was the reporting by the Los Angeles Times that the committee intended to secretly record potential witnesses, people being talked to by investigators, and subjecting them to psychological stress evaluators. Now, I've seen a transcript of that meeting. In reading the article, I think it's very interesting. Every single statement in that article begins with Mr. Sprague said, Sprague contended, he said, except the paragraph which has caused the biggest ruckus, which was the committee also intends to conduct secret surveillance of witnesses and subject their statements to psychological stress evaluators, which are voice-activated lie detectors.
Because those items had been called for in the budget requested by Sprague.
Well, it didn't say that. I mean, the implication of the article was that, yeah, I think it was an inference drawn from that, but it did not say that. Now, the denials by the committee have never...
George Lardner wants to respond to that particular point.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about that. The day the LA Times article appeared, or the day after, I can't recall which, but the committee was having a meeting. Don Edwards' letter was delivered to Gonzalez.
Don Edwards is chairman of the House
chairman of the
Subcommittee on
House Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights, who took umbrage at what he had read in the LA Times. And at that meeting, or in the hallway outside, a spokesman for the committee assumed at the time that Sprague had meant to secretly record people with those transmitters and then subject them to psychological stress evaluators. Sprague, by then, was denying any such intent, saying all he meant to do was have investigators wear them, and so if they were tailing somebody from bar to bar, they could say, hey, Joe, so-and-so is leaving the bar. Edwards wrote another letter in response to that explanation, saying he didn't see why a House committee should be tailing people. But beyond that, Sprague, around the same time, gave an interview to Skeptic magazine, in which he clearly said that he intended to subject people to psychological stress evaluators without telling them about it, and gave some examples from his career as a Philadelphia prosecutor where they called somebody up, some foreman of a plant, over the phone and said, did you do it? And questions like that. The guy said, no. And they subjected him to the test and then showed that he was lying or thought he was lying, and they started tailing Joe.
Well, Mr. Sprague, of course, is central to this. Mr. Polikoff, would you not concede, a minute ago you said that Sprague was guilty of some bad judgment. Would you concede that this was bad judgment on Sprague's part and has caused a lot of his own problems?
I would concede that some of the things that Sprague had in mind as psychological stress evaluators are one of them. I think the transmitters, regardless of what he intended to use them for, I think that was bad judgment. I think that was something that he should have anticipated Congress would have had problems with. The thing is, Sprague came down here as a prosecutor, and Sprague was told to conduct the investigation the way he saw fit. Now, I think the problem was that nothing was laid out. Congress didn't lay out, and I think Downing didn't lay out, and that was a fault of Mr. Downing's, exactly what type of procedures would be proper and what procedures wouldn't be proper. Now, maybe Congress doesn't want to conduct an investigation that way, and I think that's a determination that ought to be made, but I don't think that one can automatically draw fault with the fact that a person who was brought down with a background as a prosecutor, with a background in a district attorney's office, that person intends to use the same techniques that he used in the district attorney's office.
Let me ask Nick Horrick a question about Sprague. Is Sprague his own worst enemy in this case?
I think he's coming on. I want to, particularly on this point, when we say that Congress didn't set out a pattern of what would be proper, I find even a prosecutor will think twice before he would use a technique like stress evaluator, because he's bound to get caught up in the challenge of the fact that the guy wasn't fully advised of his rights, fully conscious of what was happening to him. Where's Sprague been for 2 or 3 years? We've done nothing in this city but uncover misuse of these very techniques by all the agencies he's out to investigate. So it seems to me that would be a flag to him.
I think one of the things we have to deal with is that the position of the committee from the very beginning, and whether from a civil liberties point of view you approve of it or not, the position of the committee from the beginning was that any recording, or all witnesses would be recorded. Yeah. And they would be recorded openly with their consent. If they didn't consent, they would not be recorded. Now, that's something also that really hasn't been followed in the press.
Mr. Polikoff, let me just ask you what your assessment is. Where is this all going to end? Has this committee had it? Or is there a compromise going to be worked out? What's your prediction?
I think that unless the Speaker of the House can work out a compromise that's acceptable to Mr. Gonzalez and acceptable to the other members of the committee will die.
Do you think that should happen? Or do you agree with what Nick Horrick said a while ago, that nobody wouldn't have credibility now because of the circus?
No, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that there's going to be a difficult time restoring credibility, but I think the staff that's been compiled down there is an excellent one, and they haven't really been given a chance.
Okay. George Lardner, what's your view of what's going to happen?
I don't know. I think that the leadership is trying to work out a compromise, but they haven't gotten very far, so far as I can tell. The trouble, basic trouble, I think, is that the committee, or a majority of it, is for Sprague, but that wouldn't be true on the House floor by any means. Gonzalez would win on the House floor. So they've got to, it seems to me, try to work out a compromise where it doesn't get to the House floor and still make Gonzalez happy within the committee. And Jim Wright, the House Majority Leader, said today that it would be a mistake to speculate that both Sprague and Gonzalez are going to go. But I don't see how you can speculate that both Gonzalez and Sprague are going to stay. So that's about where we are.
Nick Horrick?
I'll stand with their predictions on the future of the committee, but I think the question is the future of the investigation. I think it's in deep trouble. I think it was a highly difficult, nearly impossible investigation to reopen a murder of a man 12 years, 15 years gone by, and to find the witnesses and then to have all this circus as the starting point. I don't think it's going to serve the purpose.
Thank you. Robin?
Thank you in Washington. Good night, Jim.
Good night, Robin.
Thank you, Mr. Polikoff. Jim Lehrer and I'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night. Good evening. There's a strong chance that you do not really believe that the full truth is known about the assassinations of John F. Kennedy or Martin Luther King. According to a Gallup poll, 80% of Americans think that persons other than Lee Harvey Oswald or James Earl Ray were involved. For 7 months, a congressional committee has been charged with answering that massive doubt. So far, the committee has investigated itself more than the assassinations. And yesterday, the recently resigned chief counsel, Richard Sprague, said the committee was such a political mess that a special prosecutor was needed to investigate what purports to be new evidence and to find the truth. Tonight, is there really new evidence, and should the probe be left to Congress? Jim?
Robin, just 2 weeks ago, the House Assassinations Committee had come within a hair of squabbling itself right out of business. The House voted March 30 to give the committee the 2 years it wanted to complete its investigations. But the go-ahead came only after the resignation of Committee Counsel Sprague the night before. Many observers believe the going of Sprague was the price for the committee's life. Sprague, the prosecutor from Philadelphia, had been the center of a spectacular flap with a prior chairman of the committee, Congressman Henry Gonzalez of Texas. Gonzalez's rage with Sprague finally caused the congressman to resign the chairmanship. That and the committee's many other very public problems were still simmering when the March 30 vote came up. So Sprague left and went to Mexico on vacation. He returned to Washington yesterday to get a few things off his chest, and he's here with us tonight. Mr. Sprague, in retrospect, was it a mistake for Congress to even attempt to investigate the Kennedy and King assassinations?
I don't think it was a mistake, because I think that it's important to make a determination whether or not the Congress is the proper agency to do it. I think it's better that an attempt was made. The attempt has been made, and I think that the answer, at least to me, is that the Congress is not the proper agency to do it.
Why not?
Congress is a political animal. The membership in the Congress is people who run for office, who play to the constituency, who play to what they believe is the will of the public. There are too many individuals who feel that they have to be in charge of the investigation. To investigate crime, to investigate a murder, you need a professional prosecutor in charge of that team who has the freedom to act, the freedom to decide, the freedom to be painstaking, the freedom to be methodical without having to play to the Congress or the public, and without having to justify his existence as he goes along.
Did you have to play to the politics of Congress and to the needs of the public, or as Congress saw the needs of the public?
I think there was a demand that we play to those needs constantly.
Well, do you think that the problems of this committee are endemic to Congress, or was this a special little aberration of Congress?
No, I do not think, in retrospect, that the Congress is the proper agency in our whole institution of government to engage in an investigation of murder. You cannot have 435 individuals feeling they are the bosses over a team of investigators or 12 members of a committee. And one of the bases upon which I had been attacked was who was in charge of this investigation, the committee or Sprague. Well, I can understand that thinking by congressmen. Unfortunately, that kind of thinking interferes with a proper criminal investigation.
But Mr. Sprague, Congress got a lot of gold stars for its investigation of the Watergate, the impeachment proceedings, the CIA and the FBI investigations. Why couldn't they do this too?
I'm not sure about the gold stars that they got in the CIA investigation. I think the gold
Somebody gave them some gold stars, all right.
Well, I have a question about
all
that.
Right.
The gold
all
star
right.
that they received was in the impeachment. I agree with that. And I have had a strong question in my own mind whether without the tapes they would have gotten gold stars. There was something that definitive that existed which made really the work of the group that was investigating pretty final. There could be no really argument with the tapes. Had it just been something dependent upon what a John Dean said, let's say, contradicted by somebody else, I feel fairly confident they would not have earned gold stars.
As a result, though, of your 7 months with this committee, you're still convinced, however, that there should be an investigation of some kind, but that it should be done by someone else?
Absolutely.
Who should it be done by?
I would like to see a special prosecutor appointed by the President of the United States with the ability to have an independent staff, non-FBI, non-CIA, with adequate funding to investigate quietly and ultimately to produce the results of that investigation to the President and the American public.
Do you think that such an investigation, that what you have learned thus far in your 7 months is justified?
Absolutely. I think that it's not a matter of talking about what is new. I think that is something that is conjured up because it has some excitement to it. There are questions that exist from the beginning in both of these cases that justify a definitive investigation.
All right. Mr. Sprague, thank you. Robin?
The Select Committee is divided into 2 task forces. One on the Kennedy assassination is headed by Richardson Pryor of North Carolina. That on the Martin Luther King slaying is held by Washington, D.C.'s non-voting representative in Congress, Walter Fauntroy. Representative Fauntroy, is Mr. Sprague right? Is Congress incapable of handling this investigation?
Well, in the first instance, I would respectfully disagree on that particular point. I think I would agree that it would be simpler if the President appointed a special prosecutor and that it proceeded in the fashion that Mr. Archibald Cox proceeded in the Watergate matter. I think, however, that the committee can function in a fashion that Mr. Sprague and the members of the committee wish it to function, that is, to conduct a responsible investigation with competent staff to assure that it's done in a proper and professional manner. Let me say, as one of those who was a sponsor of the original resolution, that we were faced with a unique situation. In the first instance, the Congress had never investigated a murder in this sense, and in the second instance, we were faced with a situation where the executive branch was almost automatically ruled out because of the revelations which had come to light because of previous.
So Congress had to do something.
Previous Senate and Congressional Committee investigations. So that's my view on it.
I see. Just so I'm clear, do you believe there should be a special prosecutor appointed now, or you would have liked one to have been appointed in the first place?
Yes, I would have liked one to have been appointed in the first instance. In fact, I thought of that, but with the administration which was in office at that time, I thought that was not likely.
Or do you think one should be appointed now? Do you agree with Mr. Sprague?
No, I think now we will finally be able to get down to the work of doing the investigation. And let me say again that over these 7 months, we have been struggling to get an investigation underway. And the circumstances under which the committee was established created problems. We had a committee established, then we had 3 months to develop a budget. And once we had developed a budget, we became embroiled in a public discussion of whether that budget was necessary. And subsequent to that, a squabble, not between members of the committee, or among members of the committee, but between the members of the committee and one chairman. And incidentally, I do want to take exception to the remark made earlier that the committee has been squabbling.
Can I ask you this? Mr. Sprague has said that the committee was under enormous political pressure to go the politically expedient route and produce sensational results. Do you agree with that? Did you feel that pressure?
I would not say it as strongly as that, obviously, because of the way in which we were constituted, with the necessity of developing over a limited period of time a budget, 3 months to be exact, and the need to justify that budget. We were thrown into a political situation. And I am, for one, grateful that we're now over that stage and we can begin to do the kind of professional job that we'd all envisioned from the outset.
There's an internal memo of the committee dated March 17th, which I guess inadvertently became public, which members are quoted as talking about the need for a choreography or scenario of public disclosures to raise public and congressional interest. Does that not argue some sort of sensationalism in order to keep the committee alive?
Yes, I have admitted to the fact that we were placed in a political situation during the startup period. I submit now that with that over, with the Congress committed to a 2-year study, that we can get down to what we had planned to do from the outset, and that is to conduct a responsible investigation, taking our time and dealing with information in the kind of fashion that I think responsible prosecutors or other investigators should.
Thank you, Mr. Fonfrey.
One man who has been particularly critical of the way the committee has conducted itself is Congressman Robert Bauman, Republican from Maryland. He voted no on March 30 to a continuation of the committee, in fact. Congressman, you originally supported the creation of the committee. What turned you sour on it?
I think my original support was premised on a discussion that I had with the first chairman of the committee, Tom Downing, who represented an adjoining district with mine. I had real misgivings about whether or not the Congress of the United States could indeed accomplish this kind of an investigation. And Congressman Downing, who I think generally has pretty good judgment, said that he thought that this would be a very calm, quiet, and judicious approach to the remaining questions, tying up loose ends and trying to answer the public concern about the deaths of these two great American leaders. And largely on the strength of that, I voted for the creation of the committee. And I must confess that my judgment was wrong. I think in the ensuing months, many of the things that came about perhaps should have been I should have seen it, other members of Congress should have seen, and I find myself in unusual agreement with Mr. Sprague this evening in that I don't think the Congress of the United States, the political animal that it is capable of conducting the kind of sensitive investigation which, when it is all completed, will lay to rest once and for all of these questions. We are indeed politicians. Perhaps that was the collapse, although I gather that Mr. Sprague had strong opinions as well as some of the congressmen. But I don't think this committee is going to achieve its ends. It's already destroyed its credibility nationally, and no matter who the personnel may be as far as staff, I don't think that the American public will believe the final report of this committee if it's written next week or 10 years from now.
Just because of all the problems it's had during this 7 months, you think it doesn't matter what this committee says if people aren't going to believe it?
Well, for instance, Delegate Fauntleroy made a sort of a glancing reference in just a few moments ago to the inability of the executive department to investigate itself.
Well, I have no evidence that connects the CIA and the FBI directly with the deaths of these people. Maybe they made mistakes, but the committee investigation in the Senate went over this ground, and on a number of occasions he has referred, sort of alluded to this this activities on the part of these investigative branches of the government. It's somehow being at fault in these assassinations, whether afterwards or before is never clear.
Well,
I think there's always going to be doubt.
What do you think should be done? Anything?
At this particular point, I don't think there is any way that we're going to be able to satisfy, nor should we expend the kind of money that Mr. Sprague suggested, $13 million, hundreds of investigators, more than any other congressional committee.
It finally went down to, what, 2.8, didn't it?
I think that was the last figure, which was a sort of a sacrifice figure in order to maintain the committee's life at all. But I just don't think that even now, if we spend that kind of money and that kind of effort, I have a book at home in one of my library shelves called Why Was Abraham Lincoln Murdered by Otto Eisenschimmel. It was written in the 30s, years after his death, and I suspect the same kind of syndrome will follow the deaths of any great leaders of any country.
Well, let's, Mr. Sprague, what about the theory that the House leadership never wanted this investigation to succeed in the first place? Do you buy that?
Yes, I happen to think that they did not, and that the initial creation of this committee was a token effort for political purposes without the thought of there really being a complete investigation. Can I respond to one thing that Congressman Bowman just said? You know, he talks about his interest in reading a book in Abraham Lincoln written in the 30s. That's not the issue. The issue is if, in fact, there are people who are in existence who have taken part in the murder of a former president of the United States or a former civil rights leader, they should be brought to justice now. And you don't sit around and let people write books. Now, I think, you know, being blunt about it, the congressman here, Congressman Bowman, his attack on this committee was because he wanted to be protective of the agencies he just spoke about, the FBI and the CIA. There have been points raised about those agencies. Now, it does not mean they're involved in the assassination, but it is in the public interest to know once and for all, did those agencies do anything wrong? If so, what? And was that wrong in any way connected with the assassination? If it wasn't, let it be known. If it was, let it be known.
What were you referring to, Congressman Fauntleroy? You were referring to the FBI surveillance of Martin Luther King. Is that one of the elements you had in mind?
No, as a matter of fact, I was referring to Book 5 of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, which I called to the gentleman's attention on the floor of the House, which indicated that it felt that the investigation into the assassination of the president was deficient by virtue of the fact that the CIA and the FBI had withheld information which, had it made available to the Warren Commission, might substantially have changed the direction and perhaps even the conclusions of the commission.
Such as, say, the attempts on Castro's life.
Without question. So that I would agree with Mr. Sprague that not only is there was there a basis for the establishment of the committee, but that on basis of what we have been able to do on a limited basis in the 7 months that we've been operational, these investigations certainly should continue.
Are they convinced you, Congressman?
No, and I might just add one point. My concern is certainly for the intelligence agencies of this country. If there's been wrongdoing, I think there's been adequate investigation to bring these points out before. The gentleman's quoting from a previous Senate investigation. But my concern is also as a taxpayer and as a member of Congress. The thing that really disturbed me most is when I picked up the paper one morning during the Christmas recess to see that not only had Mr. Sprague recommended $13 million over a 2-year period, unprecedented in the annals of Congress, but that the committee had gone along with it without one dissenting voice and hardly a question asked. And it seems to me that's not the responsible approach to this kind of investigation.
With Mr. Sprague sitting here, let me ask the two of you a question. It's been suggested that Mr. Sprague was in some ways his own worst enemy. Would you agree with that?
No, I think Mr. Sprague was a victim of the circumstances under which we were forced to operate. I think he brought to us the kind of professionalism which I think is indispensable to a congressional investigation of these two murders. And I think he brought a perspective that was supported by 11 members of the Congress from a broad spectrum.
Well, then why did you drop him?
We, as I indicated, or as we've indicated, the question on basis of the whip count we've taken indicated that we were likely to have a choice between continuing the investigation, which we were all convinced was necessary, or losing Mr. Sprague.
Now, let's talk about some new evidence now. Robin?
Yes, just so we know what we're talking about, let me tell you the main points of what purports to be the new evidence. Last Tuesday, a Russian exile, George de Mohrenschildt, killed himself after learning that the committee wanted to interview him. De Mohrenschildt had recently been released from psychiatric care in Dallas. A Dutch journalist, Willem Oltmans, claimed de Mohrenschildt had told him he was a middleman between Lee Harvey Oswald and Texas oilman H.L. Hunt and various anti-Castro Cubans. Hunt denies any connection. In March, the committee cited an alleged meeting between Oswald and an FBI agent in Dallas. The committee also said there was new evidence linking Oswald to the man who killed him, Jack Ruby. There is also claimed to be a connection between Ruby and Santos Traficante, a mobster who took the Fifth Amendment 14 times before the committee. The committee has also reported new evidence of how and from whom Dr. King's convicted assassin, James Earl Ray, got help in escaping from prison, procuring weapons, and money. Jim?
Mr. Sprague, has the committee turned up anything really new in terms of hard evidence that needs pursuing, in your opinion?
The answer is that they have turned up evidence that needs pursuing. When you use the word hard evidence, the phrase hard troubles me because I'm not sure what you mean. I think there's an obligation to investigate all leads, and I think to put a title on it, hard, soft, is not the correct way to investigate. We have to take what leads come to our attention and see what it is that we develop from that, whether it in fact is supported or disproven. Now, the thing that we did do, and we had a very limited time, because we did not really get underway as far as I'm concerned to investigate, is that we did ascertain enough information that was not yet corroborated or disproven to merit investigation. Now, that's the most I think that can be said. And of
Significant things, Mr. Sprague, or minor things?
Well, I don't know how significant something is until I go down that trail and find out what it leads to. I do not know, for example, right now, when it was determined, there's evidence indicating that certain tapes that the CIA said that they had of Oswald in Mexico City had been destroyed prior to the assassination of President Kennedy. We have some information that perhaps they weren't destroyed, that they were in existence after that assassination, and the voice on those tapes was not Oswald. Now, is that significant in terms of the assassination? I do not know yet. But that has to be investigated.
What about, you went down, you had one conversation with James Earl Ray in Tennessee. Two, excuse me. Did he tell you anything that made you feel that there was good reason to go on and press that investigation?
Absolutely, and as a matter of fact, that in a sense emphasizes my point about the way in which you investigate. You cannot just go to Mr. Ray and trot in there and have an interview and be satisfied with what answers you get and trot out. It's building up a relationship over a period of time. That's the way an investigator proceeds. Now, from the amount of time spent with Mr. Ray, approximately 6 to 7 hours in 2 days, it's obvious that there are things to be developed from Mr. Ray himself.
It is.
Yes, go ahead.
It's for this reason that I agree with Mr. Sprague that we ought to continue this investigation, and it's for this reason that I disagree when he claims that the Congress cannot conduct it, that a responsible committee of the Congress cannot do it. I think we were proceeding in a very acceptable fashion in handling the Ray question. I regret very much that we were under pressure by members of the Congress in a political context to give some indication of why the investigation should continue in order to be established for 2 years. We're established for 2 years now, and I want to pursue a number of leads that have to do with, which we cannot now corroborate, but which I think we are obligated to pursue on behalf of the American people.
What are they, Congressman?
Well, I'll cite just one example of one which came to the attention of the gentleman and the other members of the Congress on the floor of the House during the course of the debate on this subject. A member of the Congress received a letter from a police officer in his district, which police officer identified FBI agents who he claimed offered him $500,000 to kill Dr. King on 2 occasions. I don't know the reliability of this potential witness, but I certainly think it's worth pursuing, particularly when one of our members of the committee, who incidentally had twice voted against the resolution, having checked out what he felt to be on a cursory level, on a threshold level, the credibility of this person, said that he felt that we needed to investigate that. I think it's important.
Congressman Bowman, what do you make of all this evidence? Don't these questions make you think that there's something that needs pursuing?
I think any time that you have an investigation of this nature, of a sensational deaths of 2 American leaders, you're going to have people coming out of the woodwork, many of whom are totally off balance. And I think it is interesting that the committee, the day after it was reconstituted by the Congress, should devote its activity to holding a hearing secondhand, a man who had committed suicide, the witness having claimed to talk to him, reciting what he supposedly told him, a witness who in fact had appeared before the Warren Commission, and out of that the next morning headlines is that Texas oil man and H.L. Hunt may have killed John F. Kennedy. Now, if that is the way we begin calm, rational, and quiet approaches to these matters, it doesn't seem to me to be that is the approach that the American people would have any confidence in. And I must confess that whether we need a special prosecutor or not, all of this evidence that's been discussed here at this table tonight and has been regurgitated in the press morning after morning, night after night in the headlines, should and could be handled by the United States Department of Justice in the hands of someone perhaps that Delegate Fauntleroy now has confidence in. That's the proper forum for criminal prosecutions, not the Congress of the United States in the hands of politicians looking for headlines.
You know, just true there. In a sense, I agree and I disagree. I agree that the Congress is not the vehicle for it. But when Congressman Bowman says that these people come out of the woodwork in a derogatory vein, in a sense, that is putting the rabbit in the hat. We don't know that they are out of the woodwork until we investigate.
That's right.
Now, it may turn out that they are out of the woodwork. It may turn out, however, that what they are saying is legitimate. We ought not to let the American people continually be subject to these suggestions, these innuendos, and they may be distortions. Let's find out. Or what are we afraid to find out? I don't think so. If there are agencies involved, let's find out. If they're not involved, let's clear them. The only question is, not should you do it, but who is the proper agency to do it?
Yeah. Do you think the committee is presently constituted with the budget it's got, Congressman Fauntleroy, can actually do this investigation? I mean, it's a severe cutback from what it wanted.
Obviously, there is some question, and all of us on the committee, with reluctance, agreed to a limited budget. Mr. Sprague himself, and can speak for himself on this question, has indicated that he has serious questions about the adequacy of that budget.
Could I ask you in a word, do you think it can manage on this? We're just about to end. Can it manage?
We're going to manage on it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all, gentlemen, very much in Washington, and good night, Jim. Jim Lehrer and I'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night.
Good evening. To put it in its most dramatic, most chilling terms, there may have been a person, as yet unknown, who conspired with Lee Harvey Oswald to assassinate President Kennedy in Dallas 15 years ago. That he also fired a gun, probably a rifle, at the presidential motorcade. That he was on a grassy knoll to the front and right of the presidential limousine. All of this now looms as a possibility in terms other than theoretical as a result of congressional testimony today. Two acoustical experts told the House Assassinations Committee that tests show a 95% probability that there were 4 instead of the previously believed 3 shots, and that one of them came from the grassy knoll rather than the Texas School Book Depository, where Oswald is believed to have fired the other 3. The matter was pretty much left hanging right there when the committee adjourned earlier this evening. It officially goes out of business this weekend, and it's expected to ask the Justice Department to pursue it. We want to take a look at the key portions of today's testimony and then get the reaction of Arlen Specter. Mr. Specter was an assistant counsel to the Warren Commission in its investigation 15 years ago. First, the testimony. The two sound experts were Dr. Mark Weiss and Ernest Ashinkansi. It was Dr. Weiss who laid out the basic finding.
It is our conclusion that as the result of very careful analysis, it appears that with a probability of 95% or better, there was indeed a shot fired from the grassy knoll.
Would you very generally describe for us what the principles, the scientific principles, are that you utilized in your work?
Well, the principles are basically the fundamental principles in acoustics, namely that if someone makes a loud noise somewhere, say like here, that sort of thing, everybody in this room can hear that noise, which means that that sound moves out in all directions, in all possible directions. A second principle is that that sound which they hear directly also will bounce off walls and be reflected. And so they will hear not only the direct sound, but as well sounds which are called echoes, bouncing from walls, from corners, and other surfaces. Third principle, also very fundamental, is that the speed of sound is constant in whatever direction it may go, so that the further you are from the source of the sound, the longer it will take for that sound to reach you, whether that source is in fact the original source of the sound or a reflecting surface, which would cause an echo. Now, I was going to illustrate basically what is meant by echoes at this point here. I think pretty much everybody is aware of what happens if you stand, let's say, at a canyon and you holler into the canyon, something like hello, and you'll get back a series of hello, 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 that sort of thing. You can hear each of these echoes in such a circumstance because the reflecting surfaces are quite far apart and from you and from each other. Now, in a situation such as an echo generated in Dealey Plaza, you have reflecting surfaces also, the walls and corners of the buildings there. They too will generate echoes, but they will tend to come in very much more closely in sequence, so that even if you have a very short, sharp sound, such as a rifle firing, okay, or again a clap of the hands, you'll get back what to an observer, or many observers, will sound like a single loud bang type thing. But if you were to record that and say play it back at 1/4 or 1/8 the speed at which you recorded it, you would actually be able to hear the independent echoes coming back. In fact, what you would hear would be something like bang, 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 and diminishing in amplitude as you got to hearing echoes that came over longer and longer paths. To the human ear, you don't hear that because the first loud echo sort of partially deafens the ear, and it decreases your sensitivity to the later arriving sounds. What you hear, therefore, is a single loud sound with a diminishing intensity.
Would you very generally describe what the basic process was that you went through in applying these principles to the available data?
Well, basically, the idea was this. Since, as I indicated, each position in the plaza would have a unique set of echoes associated with it, then if in fact the sound heard on the police tape at the location of the third group, for which there was some uncertainty, was in fact the sound heard by a microphone, which a microphone, now remember, is kind of an electronic ear. It hears the same as an ear will hear. If that indeed was the case, then I ought to be able to find a position for that microphone and a position for a shooter of a rifle such that I could predict the pattern of echoes that would have been received by that microphone to a sufficient degree of accuracy that I could say that this kind of match of a predicted pattern with the observed pattern is so close that the probability that what I'm really looking at on the Dallas police tape is noise becomes very small. And so we set out to be able to predict what the echo structures would be at various locations in Dealey Plaza. And this was the whole art of it. And as I say, it was done by using simple concepts that sound will travel in all directions from a source and that it will reflect off surfaces and travel back.
I mispronounced Dr. Weiss's colleague's name. It's Ashkenazi. All right, for more than 3 hours, committee members questioned the two experts on the details of how they reached their findings. The magnitude of the conclusions was obvious to all throughout, and the chairman, Congressman Louis Stokes, Democrat of Ohio, began the questioning by raising that point.
I am sure that as a scientist, that you are aware of the enormous impact that your testimony has here today. Because if the committee accepts your testimony, the committee then in effect accepts the fact that on that particular day in 1963 when the president was assassinated, there were two shooters in Dealey Plaza. From that premise, one can further assume association. And then from association, there can be the further legal assumption, the possibility of a conspiracy. So I'm sure that you're aware of the enormous impact of your testimony here today in terms of history. Is that correct?
I am, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Then as a scientist, you are comfortable with the statement to this committee that beyond a reasonable doubt and to a degree of 95% or better, there were 4 shots in Dealey Plaza.
Well, I would agree with that, with the somewhat clarification that since our work concentrated primarily on the third shot, the one from the grassy knoll area, I could simply, for the moment, limit the statement to that with a confidence level of 95% or higher, which I guess if I were a lawyer, I might well express as beyond a reasonable doubt, that shot took place. And then relying upon the corresponding confidence expressed by Dr. Barger about the other shots, I would agree with the statement that there's an overall probability of 95% or better that there were 4 shots fired in Dealey Plaza.
Do you have an opinion as to whether, if in fact there was a shot from the grassy knoll, whether it hit anything in the motorcade?
I have no way of knowing that, sir. There's no way of predicting or determining that from the data that are available.
You have cleared up for us the question as to whether you employed the marvels and refinements of computerized electronics to reach your conclusion about the 95% chance of a shot from the grassy knoll. You've also dealt with noises which are indistinguishable to the unaided ear. And is it your testimony that the shots that you have distinguished were not backfires?
Not exactly so, sir. In the case of shot number 3, since there is evidence of a shock wave preceding the muzzle blast, then it would have to be concluded that this was not a backfire, since backfires are not known to produce shock wave sounds.
Then your answer is yes, that the shot which you examined, the noise that you examined, was not in fact a backfire.
That is correct, sir.
If it had been a backfire, you testified, it would have had to come from the grassy knoll.
That is correct, since I did not concern myself with the nature of the sound, only the location at which it originated.
But from your knowledge of sound and the velocity of a missile traveling at that speed, it could not have been a backfire.
That is correct.
All right, thank you. Secondly, the problem that we have is that nobody saw anyone with a rifle in that area. And my question is, could a shot from a pistol have created the same noise, shock waves, and echoes?
In order to do so, the bullet fired from such a pistol would have to have left the muzzle at supersonic speeds. And so if indeed there are pistols that fire supersonic bullets, the answer would be yes in such a circumstance.
I guess my question, Mr. Chairman, now goes to staff, Mr. Cornwell or Mr. Blakey, and that is, what do we know about the alleged encounter with a person bearing Secret Service credentials in the area of the grassy knoll?
Mr. Fauntleroy, the committee did look into that incident and did what it could 15 years later to determine whether it occurred, and if it occurred, could we identify the individual. The testimony, in essence, is that an individual identified himself by showing what he said to be Secret Service credentials behind the picket fence, and based on that was allowed to continue. A careful examination of where all of the Secret Service agents were that day and their duty assignments indicates that no Secret Service agent was in that area. And that's about as far as we've been able to carry it.
But who had the encounter?
My memory is a policeman, one of the first to come up over the fence, ironically with a gun drawn, encountered an individual who, seeing the gun, identified himself as a Secret Service agent and was thus able to pass on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pryor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along the lines that Mr. Edgar was questioning you concerning assumptions that may have been made about the scene and how they may affect your calculations, you mentioned when you were discussing the original assumptions you made that the tape recorder on the Dallas police vehicle was 5% slow. I wonder if you could discuss that a little bit and tell us, one, how do you know it was 5% slow? And two, how important is it? What difference does it make that we be accurate about that?
As a matter of fact, we know that it is 5% or approximately 5% slow from the time analyses done by Dr. Barger in these data having been presented to the committee during the open hearing in September when he discussed this factor. And he did this by extrapolating a straight line to fit the time announcements made by the dispatcher on Channel 1, which is the channel on which these data were recorded, and found that its slope was about 5% or something in that vicinity. Now, this adjustment of 5% is only an approximate one, and in fact, it was altered slightly during our analyses as we found it necessary to alter it so that the data fell in a little bit better and a little bit more meaningfully. We checked with Dr. Barger on the validity of doing this, and his opinion was there was absolutely no reason that it could not have been done that way, that in fact the fit that he had was over an average of a number of minutes, and that the dicta belt itself was not notorious for holding constant speed, so that its speed could have been varying by a minute amount during this period of time, and so a small upward or downward adjustment was perfectly valid. Now, it therefore was necessary to make such. This adjustment of 5% is only an approximate one, and in fact, it was altered slightly during our analyses as we found it necessary to alter it so that the data fell in a little bit better and a little bit more meaningfully. We checked with Dr. Barger on the validity of doing this, and his opinion was there was absolutely no reason that it could not have been done that way, that in fact the fit that he had was over an average of a number of minutes, and that the dicta belt itself was not notorious for holding constant speed, so that its speed could have been varying by a minute amount during this period of time, and so a small upward or downward adjustment was perfectly valid.
The thing that we've been reading about in the newspaper and what you've testified this morning is that you're 95% sure that what we're seeing is a fourth shot. And if I understand the use of the word probability, it's based on some history. I wonder if you could describe the history around which your 95% probability is based.
Well, the probability that we're talking about here is simply that sort of calculation that says, well, look, let's not even talk in terms of echoes and so forth. We have a range here of about 300 milliseconds, and let's divide it up into 2 millisecond intervals. That gives us 150 of them, all right? Now, supposing that we're dealing with a deck of 150 cards, and I tell you that in this deck there are only 12 spades in the cards, all right? And I give you 14 chances to deal cards from the deck. What are the chances that you're going to deal out 10 spades? The probability of that is less than 5%. In other words, the probability of something happening by a random process that will closely match that would have generated, in fact, that set of data that closely matches a known set of events, which is to say a predicted set of echoes, they're the knowns. The chances of that happening purely by noise occurring is less than 5%.
I must, without being personal, now pursue some lines of questioning which I think will be asked of us and of you and of your professional characteristics and findings. So please don't take the initial questions, at least personally, but I think that they must be asked. When you and Mr. Askenazi entered into this series of mathematical and geometrical computations, did you set out with any particular result desired?
No, sir.
No, sir.
We had no preconception as to what we were going to find. If anything, when we first heard the tape recording and first began to examine the data, our initial reaction was, somebody's got to be kidding. This can't be gunshots. But as we examined the data more carefully, subjected it to all the tests that we have described, to the procedures that we have described, the results of the analyses themselves convinced us of where we were heading, obviously. We did not have any plan or any objective other than to do the best we could to find out what really this data represent.
What? Yes, go ahead.
May say just one line, is that the numbers could not be refuted. That was our problem. The numbers just came back again and again the same way, pointing only in one direction as to what these findings were. There just didn't seem to be any way to make those numbers go away, no matter how hard we tried. It was not a question of interpretation of the numbers. It was a question of what the analysis yielded. And the mechanical analysis, because it was just a hand calculator, a piece of string, as you saw it, a tape measure, and it all just came out the same way.
Well, what were your instructions from the committee staff when you set out to extend or refine Dr. Barger's work?
Is there any way to take Dr. Barger's statement of 50% and move it off-center either way?
And so you're telling me that it really didn't matter to you which way it moved, that you were trying to get at more certainty than a probability of 50-50 for a fourth shot? Sir. Did you have any instructions from any member of the committee, any suggestions, any recommended lines of pursuit that you should follow?
We work totally independently of the committee.
All right, the work of Dr. Weiss and Mr. Ashkenazi followed earlier acoustical findings of Dr. James Barger, also a sound expert. Barger, testifying in September, had said that the probability of a shot's coming from the grassy knoll was only 50-50. Dr. Barger testified today and said that the later work was a natural extension of his own and that he had reviewed it all and he agreed with the conclusions. Committee counsel Robert Blakey closed the session today by summarizing testimony from other expert witnesses who had been asked to reassess their findings in light of the acoustical results. Blakey said there was no medical evidence that a bullet fired from the grassy knoll hit Kennedy, and that if such a bullet was fired, it cannot yet be accounted for medically or any other way. The committee itself is meeting an executive session tonight to vote on its conclusions, not only on the Kennedy assassination, but that of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as well. The committee's mandate does run out Sunday, and Chairman Stokes has already said he will not ask the House leadership for an extension. Thus, the questions raised, including the ones concerning the acoustical tests, will be turned over to others, probably the Justice Department, for further investigation. Now, the 4 bullets grassy knoll idea, of course, runs directly counter to the findings of the Warren Commission. A key member of the Warren Commission staff involved in reaching that earlier conclusion was Arlen Specter. Mr. Specter is now an attorney in Philadelphia and is with us tonight in the studios of public station WHYY, Philadelphia. Mr. Specter, does this new acoustical evidence now suggest to you the probability or even the possibility that there were 2 gunmen?
I think that the new evidence is going to have to be examined closely, but I think it is far from conclusive on suggesting a second gunman or a 4th shot. And I say that because nobody saw anybody with a rifle. And even of greater importance, no shot struck anybody in the presidential limousine or the limousine itself. And the committee counsel, Mr. Blakey, today restated the evidence which the commission reported, that President Kennedy and Governor Connally were shot from the rear, and there was no missile or bullet which struck either of them or the limousine, so that if someone shot from the grassy knoll at a relatively close distance, it's pretty hard to miss that limousine, so that I think the evidence is as yet far from conclusive. There are a couple of other considerations on my mind. As I listened to Professor Weiss, one of his comments was that if you altered a 5% deviation, as we found it necessary to do, it fit in better. And he said a small upward or downward adjustment was valid. Now, that raises a question in my mind as to what his conclusions would have been without an adjustment on the speed.
Mr. Specter, let me ask you this. What do you think should be done now? Do you think this matter should be pursued to some kind of conclusion?
I certainly do. I have always believed that if any new evidence ever came up, it ought to be examined very carefully. I think that it is unfortunate, perhaps even curious, that the only new material produced by the Congressional Committee comes on the last working day of the 2nd year of its existence. But I think that the matter ought to be pursued further, and I think it would be unfortunate to turn it over to any agency other than the one which is currently working on it. They have a staff, they have momentum. They said at the conclusion of the hearings today that they had not had an opportunity to examine photographic evidence, and I think all that ought to be pursued, and I think most logically by this committee.
Another question. Both Dr. Barger and Dr. Weiss said today that the techniques that they used in coming up with these conclusions were available 15 years ago to the Warren Commission. The question I have is why the Warren Commission did not run these tests at that time.
We never thought of it.
It was just that simple. It was just...
Well, we had some...
You had the tape, the dictabelt tape from the Dallas police motorcycle available at that time, right?
I do not know whether the commission had it or not. There were some 14 of us lawyers on it. I know that I never saw it. My area of responsibility was principally with the medical evidence. I do not know that the commission did have the tape, but there was no suggestion made at any time that any tape be examined.
Is there anything from the medical standpoint or any other part of the investigation about which you have personal knowledge that supports what the acoustical experts said today?
No, the medical evidence is all very conclusive that the shots came from behind and the rear, and the area of work which I had responsibility for was the single bullet theory. And I have been personally pleased to see that the committee's conclusions have totally supported the single bullet theory.
All right.
In terms of the fragments from Conley's wrist coming from the bullet, the single bullet, and in terms of the committee itself coming to the conclusion that the single bullet theory is valid, so that I think it is important to focus on the fact that the committee has buttressed a great many of the Warren Commission's conclusions, such as Oswald was the assassin, the same bullet hit Kennedy and Conley.
All right, Mr. Spector, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much. All right, we'll be back on Monday. I'm Jim Lara. Thank you and good night.
In essence, I would have told the trial court and jury that I did not shoot Martin Luther King Jr. just as I'm not telling this committee. And if I would have had a lawyer to represent me, I could have offered conclusive proof in support of this denial.
Surrounded by the full panoply of a congressional hearing, James Earl Ray comes from prison to deny being the killer of Martin Luther King. Good evening. James Earl Ray, sentenced nearly a decade ago for the murder of Martin Luther King, appeared before the House Assassination Committee today and said firmly he was not the killer. It was a story Ray has told often in recent years in his effort to recant his original confession and win a new trial. But the drama of today's setting gave new emphasis to his plea: live television, a heavy guard of federal marshals, and a committee eager to restore its own prestige. After testifying for over 2 hours this morning, Ray pleaded exhaustion and was excused until tomorrow morning. Civil rights leaders claiming there was a conspiracy to murder King have urged the Justice Department to support a new trial. They were told the department would look at any new evidence the committee turned up. Tonight, the credibility of James Earl Ray. Jim Lehrer is off. Charlene Hunter-Galtz in Washington. Charlene?
Robin, James Earl Ray, 50 years old, has spent most of his adult life as a criminal. He's been variously portrayed as inept, bumbling, aimless, and a loner. And because of his frequent escape attempts, he earned the cell block nickname The Mole. A native of Alton, Illinois, Ray was the eldest of 9 children, the son of an alcoholic father. He dropped out of school in the 10th grade, drifted a while, and then joined the Army. Later, he was sentenced to hard labor for drunkenness and eventually discharged for ineptness. Beginning with a typewriter theft in Los Angeles, he engaged in petty burglary and other crimes over the next 10 years. An account of one getaway from a holdup said he forgot to close the car door and fell out as the vehicle swerved around a corner. After serving about 8 years of a 20-year sentence, he escaped from the Missouri State Prison on his 3rd attempt in 1967. He then traveled to numerous cities in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, using a variety of aliases. Martin Luther King was killed in Memphis on April 4th, 1968. On April 17th, 1968, a federal warrant was issued in Birmingham for Eric Starvo Galt, one of those aliases. On May 7th, 1968, Ray was indicted for the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. On June 8th, 1968, he was arrested in London. On March 10th, 1969, he pleaded guilty to that murder. And on August 16th, 1978, this morning, he said he didn't do it. He pointed the finger at others instead, including the FBI.
I know several large publishing houses working with the FBI have offered up varied motivational allegations which are referred to below. In support of the government case against me, but it was not I who posted Martin Luther King's note suggesting he kill himself, rather it was the FBI. Nor was it the witness who celebrated upon hearing of his death. That too was the FBI. And it was also not I who in the 1930s infected blacks with syphilis germs, for experimental purposes, then declined to treat them. That was the actions of a governmental body with the acquiescence of the dominant press. The FBI was also harassing various members of my family in order to maneuver them into a position whereby they would have to perjure themselves against me in some matter related to the King case in order to escape imprisonment themselves. For instance, the FBI evidently burglarized my sister Carol Pepper's home in 1968 looking for incriminating evidence. See Jack Anderson column, November 8, 1977. Number 2, the FBI had my brother John L. Ray prosecuted and convicted for aiding and abetting a bank robbery, and the trial judge, now FBI Director William H. Webster, sentenced him to 18 years. Well, the actual robber later had his charge transferred to the Eastern District of California, where federal judge M.D. Croker sentenced the robber to 18 months. And the Wire Service reported on August 8, 1978, that the FBI had paid an informer, Oliver Patterson, to steal letters, wiretap conversations, etc., from another brother, Jerry W. Ray.
Following his escape from prison, Ray fled to Canada. He wanted to travel elsewhere but lacked documents and money. Hanging out at a Seaman's bar later, he said he met a man named Raoul, the mysterious gun-running figure Ray claims later set him up and framed him for Dr. King's murder. They met each other's needs for gun running and money. So far, no one has been able to prove Raoul's existence, but Ray clings firmly to his story about him.
Although I did contact an individual who introduced himself as Raoul. I first met him in the Neptune Tavern, 121 West Commissioner Street. He was approximately 35 to 40 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, with dark hair and a red tint in it, and he spoke with a slight Spanish accent. I assumed from his demeanor and conversation that our interests could be compatible, and after a couple meetings it was established that I was interested in some type of travel documents, while his interest was in locating someone who would, for a price, help him move some type contraband through United States Customs at the Canadian border. His proposals and my acceptance were, in essence, that I would meet him in Windsor, Canada at approximately 3:30 p.m. August 21st, 1967, near the railroad station in my automobile. That he would then provide me with certain packages to transport across the border into the United States. 4, that I would, for transporting the packages into the United States, be provided with travel documents and an unspecified amount of money. That thereafter I would sell the Plymouth automobile and travel to Birmingham, Alabama, wherein I would again meet Raoul for some similar type of smuggling operations, apparently in Mexico. Raoul had initially suggested that I go to Mobile, Alabama.
Ray said he and Raoul smuggled guns from the United States to Mexico, and in April their smuggling activities brought them to Memphis. We pick up his testimony relating to the day of the murder. Raoul, he said, had sent him to purchase infrared binoculars for nighttime viewing.
After returning to the Main Street rooming house, I told Raoul we would have to purchase the infrared attachments at an Army surplus store. I also informed him that I had not eaten since breakfast. He said go out and have a meal and take in a movie since he wanted to see some people in private that evening. But to leave the Mustang out in front, as he would most likely need it that evening or night. I then went downstairs into Jim's Grill and ordered a beer, although I did not drink it. I say this because I recall seeing a white waitress on one occasion while I was in the establishment, and on the next occasion there was a black waitress on duty. The point if I can digress here, the point I'm trying to make here is I was in the grill on 2 different occasions, at least. Leaving the grill, I sat in the Mustang 10 or 15 minutes before traveling north on Main Street and entering a bar and restaurant located on the left-hand side of the street and fairly near a movie house across the street. I ordered a sandwich, and while sitting there, recalled that I had changed the back rear tire on the right side, one facing the front of the Mustang, the day before, after the tire had developed a slow leak. Thinking the damaged tire could be fixed, especially if the Mustang should be used that night, I returned to the Mustang and drove it north on Main Street for maybe 3 or 4 blocks before turning right and traveling 4 or 5 more blocks to a service station. There were 2 or 3 service stations at the intersection. I inquired of one if they could fix its spare tire while I waited, and I was informed that I would have to wait a while because of the business volume. Moving to the other station, I do not recall asking for the tire to be repaired, although I did have the Mustang serviced. Upon leaving the station, I circled around in the manner that would return me to the original parking space in front of Jim's Grill. However, when driving onto Main Street, I saw a police car parked blocking off the street that I would have to drive through in order to return to my original parking space. In addition, I saw what appeared to be 2 or 3 people running or walking rather fast up opposite the police car. I then veered off to the left toward South Memphis, traveling to what appeared to be a predominantly black community. I eventually ended up in Mississippi, traveling toward New Orleans, Louisiana. It was my intention to phone New Orleans, a New Orleans number in my possession and have the party on the other end attempt to find out what, if anything, had happened in the area of the aforementioned Main Street rooming house. However, shortly after entering the state of Mississippi, I heard over the car radio that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been shot in Memphis. A short while later, approximately 15 minutes, another news bulletin on the radio stated police authorities were looking for a white Mustang and a white male subject as suspect in the shooting of Dr. King. Consequently, the first intersection I came to, I turned east traveling toward Atlanta, Georgia. If I may digress for just a second. In respect to this tire I mentioned, 3 or 4 years ago, my brother we was talking about my private property in Memphis, and he said as soon as I pled guilty, the Attorney General's office called him to the office and gave him this tire plus the floorboards out of the Mustang. So, the floor mats out of the Mustangs. But I imagine the Memphis prosecutor's office will substantiate that or disprove it. Continuing with the statement, by way of Birmingham, Alabama. Shortly after turning east, I stopped the Mustang and threw various items out of the trunk, including all of the camera equipment that Raul had me purchased for him. The equipment was still in the original wrapping cases when I discarded it. It was raining slightly at the time, and I took a cloth and attempted to wipe off any fingerprints I may have left on the outside of the Mustang.
Ray closed his statement with a scathing attack on one of his lawyers, Percy Foreman. He hired Foreman shortly after his arrest for the King murder, but soon thereafter Ray fired him. Ray claims that Foreman talked him into a false plea of guilty.
The Attorney Foreman then commenced on February 13, 1969, maneuvering me into a guilty plea. Foreman's argument for the plea were, in essence, one, that the press had already convicted me by inflaming the minds of potential jurors, that the government had bribed an alleged witness, Charles Stevens, into purging himself against me by offering Stevenson $100,000 reward to say he had saw someone favoring me leaving the rooming house where Dr. King was allegedly shot from, immediately after the shot was fired. 3, that it would in some manner be in my financial interest to plead guilty as charged. 4, that the trial judge wanted a guilty plea because he was concerned the blacks might burn down the town. In respect to Percy Foreman and the judge's ex parte meetings arranged the plea. Apparently, the two had eight meetings. Then later in March of 1969, Foreman said that if the case was not settled through a guilty plea, the government would most likely arrest my brother, Jerry W. Ray, under some type of conspiracy charge in the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. homicide. He also said that the FBI would most likely arrest my father, George Ray, who was then near 7 years old, and have him returned to the Iowa State Prison, wherein he had escaped in the 1930s. If I may digress here just a second, Mr. Chairman, my brother John Ray also mentioned this fact to me around March 7th or 8th of 1969. Now, I think Mr. Foreman, he made an oblique reference to this thing. He said something, he didn't come right out and say it directly, but he made kind of a slanting reference to it. Returning to the statement, in conjunction with the aforementioned threats and promises, Percy Foreman convinced me he would throw the case if I managed to force him to trial. In fact, in an article published in Look magazine in May of 1961, sold to the publication by Percy Foreman for $1,000, he in effect admitted he would have thrown the case if I would have forced him to trial. Consequently, through written contracts, I agreed on March 9, 1969, to enter the guilty plea.
Ray will continue his testimony tomorrow morning. Robin?
Now a little perspective on today's testimony for the benefit of those of us who have not followed in intimate detail the often confusing allegations and counter-allegations in the Ray saga. The Reverend Jesse Jackson was a staff member of Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Yesterday, he asked the Justice Department to support a new trial for Ray. Reverend Jackson, do you believe Ray's statement today that he did not kill Martin Luther King?
I am convinced that James Earl Ray did not act alone. It has not yet been established that he killed Dr. King conclusively, and yet it has not been established that he did not, because he certainly was an accomplice to that murder. We do know that he bought that rifle. We do know that he had fingerprints on that rifle, and so unless he is willing to give more information about the existence of Raoul than he has presently, then he is going to have to suffer that burden alone.
You've talked to him personally, I believe. How do you evaluate Ray's credibility now?
Well, I believe Ray really is a pathological liar. I mean, he is a subculture criminal. Ray's object for wanting to talk with us was to get out of jail. And our object for talking with Ray was to try to find out the truth, to find out not only Ray, but who all was involved in the assassination of Dr. King. I think we need to establish that Ray is not this stumbling, bumbling, inept guy. If you will listen to him reading his testimony, you'll find a guy that's fairly coherent and literate, who reads well and has a command of the language that's very different from the images we've gotten of Ray historically.
I was going to say that listening to him just now, I felt it hard to believe that that was his own language that he was reading.
Well, the fact is that he was reading it so well and so rapidly, and using words as he digressed, words like oblique, which are not words that are very common use. My only point is that Ray is not someone that's kind of stupid and kind of out of it, with a faraway look in his eye. As a matter of fact, we took Dr. Alvin Toussaint with us, a Harvard psychiatrist, just to kind of clinically observe some of Ray's demeanor. And among other things, Ray never had a psychiatrist to view him during this 10-year period. And usually lawyers, I mean, as a very elementary step, are trying to have a psychiatrist to view their client so as to determine their fitness, trying to appeal to a judge for some mercy. My real conclusion was that Ray was involved, even more involved than he has told us so far. I think Ray knows much more about Raoul than he has told us, but what I'm really concerned about is the involvement of the FBI. From the time Dr. King received the Nobel Peace Prize until 1 hour before the assassination, the FBI was on him 24 hours a day with up to 25 men, never less than 7, thousands of man-hours, millions of dollars, and it is said in some of the documents here in Washington that the same kind of vigorous search with which they go after a Russian or a foreign espionage agent or spy, all of those techniques and more were used on Dr. King. So we do know that the FBI did in fact engage in character assassination. Whether or not they went as far as physical assassination, that ultimately must come out as well in these hearings.
Can I ask you this, Reverend Jackson? I'm wondering why you and Ralph Abernathy and others are not willing to wait until this committee has come up after its exhaustive investigation with its conclusions. Do you believe the committee has more evidence that would support Ray's plea for a new trial?
Well, really, we do support the committee. I think that in as much as there has been some attempts in the last few days to not refund the committee or to extend its funding, we've simply tried to be as visible as possible, letting the Congress and the nation know that it is not right to cut off their money. We think that during this week, Ray has a chance to substantiate whether or not he deserves a trial. If indeed, in my judgment, Ray does not come with much more clarity than he has come on Raul. And Jerry Ray and Jerry Ray's relationship to Percy Foreman and Percy Foreman's relationship to whoever hired him, then he does not deserve a trial. He has a splendid opportunity to come clean before the nation.
But he has not yet, in your view, so far as today's testimony is concerned, substantiated his claim to a new trial.
My impression is that Ray is holding back, either because he's still trying to protect his family or because he's intimidated and his life is threatened. But I get the impression that when hit with the critical questions by Congressman Louis Stokes, there was a kind of hedging on some of the areas where he must come much clearer in.
Well, thank you. Charlene?
A New York Times investigative unit has been following the work of the Assassination Committee and doing its own investigations into Dr. King's murder. The chief of that unit is veteran reporter Nicholas Horrock. Nick, in your view, did anything new come out today?
There were giblets. He told us today, for the first time in his own words, how he really gets out of the Missouri State Penitentiary, which he lied about the first time, allegedly to protect a fellow prisoner. He tells us a little bit more about his money and his movements around the country. But in fact, with the exception of his mention of some material developed by Mark Lane, his lawyer, through Freedom of Information, that is the report that a man who bent over Dr. King at his death may have been an undercover policeman from Memphis Police Department, there was very little new. And even that report had some currency prior to that, but it has never been investigated properly.
You brought that up about the appearance of this person. Does that change anything, the appearance of this undercover agent, the document?
I think it points up that the ground investigation from the beginning was inadequately carried out. Reverend Jackson, for example, was at the scene and was not interviewed by the FBI. Reverend Abernathy testified yesterday he wasn't interviewed. So some very basic groundwork was not done either by police or the Bureau, and this new report would show that that might be very important, who he was, why he was there, and so forth.
And that might be the basis for some of the
conspiracy questions,
yeah.
You know, I think
excuse me just a minute, Jesse. Let me just pursue this question. Did you find Ray a credible witness today? There were many commentators who said he appeared nervous and rambling and incoherent at times.
Been in the jail for 10 years, and a lot of it alone, and I think that accounts for all of that kind of emotional thing. It's a poor day to judge him. He really hasn't been on this kind of a scene before. But on the other hand, as far as credibility, I think the question of why Raul remains such a flat character, we never know much about Raul. Now, he spends time, 6 or 7 hours of conversation. He has not one anecdote, not one interesting little thing. Raul is flat, and he's always been flat in anything Ray has said or written.
So in your view...
And so that question, that raises a serious question in my mind of credibility.
In terms of your investigations, have you been able to come up with anything more substantial about this shadowy figure?
Not anything about Ray, but I think it is very important to notice the one thing the Justice Department criticizes its own FBI for, not examining Ray's relationship with his family. And I know that many of the House investigators speculate that the one person or two people that he might not want to tell more about, who might be somehow connected with this, would be members of his own family, his loved ones. So there is a question whether Raul exists, and if he doesn't exist, is he someone Ray cannot talk about?
Right. One final question, and quickly. Some people have characterized this hearing as a catharsis, others as a circus. How do you view it?
I hope it's not a circus. I have a personal feeling about that. I hope it is not a circus, but I think that this committee has squandered an awful lot of money over the thing and an awful lot of time and left the American people at this juncture with very little more information.
And none of the evidence that has come up today, even the small bits and pieces, in your mind, justify it?
Not yet.
Thank you. Robin?
Mr. Jackson, Reverend Jackson, do you believe that even if James Earl Ray doesn't come clean on the mysterious character of Raul, and even if his own personal credibility is not established, that there is enough doubt to justify the new trial that you went to see Assistant Attorney General Civiletti about yesterday?
Well, you know, whether we go the route of trial or hearing becomes kind of technical and legal language. I think that even though that Raul is a flat character and Ray is perhaps a liar, subculture criminal, the fact that the FBI had such a tremendous commitment to destroying this man's character and ultimately his life suggests that Ray is operating within a context of some conspiracy. He may have been a cog in the wheel so small until he can't get beyond the flat character. But we are fairly convinced that circumstantial evidence suggests that there was other involvement, perhaps the government.
I see. What's your view on that, Mr. Horrocks? Do you think that, apart from Ray's credibility, are there enough doubts from your investigation to justify a new examination of this in a courtroom?
I think that the greatest loss to the country was there wasn't originally a trial. I think there should be a new examination. On the other hand, as an investigator, the trail is very cold now. There are people dead. The Times developed information about two men who allegedly offered money to kill Dr. King. Both of them are dead. Had the FBI followed up on that report when they first learned of it, at least one of those men probably would have been alive, and at least they could have interviewed him. So I'm not sure that it can be repaired now, but I do think it's worth trying.
Despite your doubts about the work of this committee, does its labor so far constitute a sufficient forum of investigation, or would only a trial, the formal proceedings in a trial, answer the demand?
I think a trial would be preferable because throughout Watergate and our other jail for perjury. The committee does have indirectly that kind of power, contempt power, but it is not as lethal as a grand jury and an immediate indictment.
Reverend Jackson, do you and Reverend Ralph Abernathy have any fear that because you, as former colleagues and close friends of Dr. King, believe there are doubts about the case, that you may be being used by James Earl Ray as part of his, as you said earlier, attempt to get out of jail?
Well, I think it's very clear that James Earl Ray wants to use us to get back to court. And we want to use the presence and the existence of James Earl Ray to find out who all was involved in this assassination. We're not deceived for one moment as to what Ray's motives are. I think the real issue here is that there has never been a trial, and there was a tremendous amount of information squashed, and perhaps a tremendous number of people killed. Let us not forget that one man in the FBI who had a tremendous body of data, a Mr. Sullivan, the number 3 man in the FBI, who had somewhat broken with the Hoover line, this line that Dr. King was a communist threat to the country and therefore had to be destroyed. Mysteriously, this man was mistaken to be a deer in Vermont and killed. He would represent a real connection with the whole FBI theory.
We have to leave it there, Reverend Jackson. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Horrocks. Good night, Charlene.
Good night, Robin.
That's all for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night.